away from me. I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses." So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, "Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, "And how much do you owe?" He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, "Take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. And he said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts, and what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God."
Well, good morning, church.
Good morning. Good morning.
I'm just having a little extra time than usual to put my head mic on. I shall be preaching from behind you. That would actually be kind of fun. Welcome to church. If you are visiting with us, my name is Joshua, and I am the pastor here. And we have been going through a series on the parables of Jesus. These parables are stories that Jesus told to communicate a powerful spiritual truth. Today's parable is probably, in many people's opinion, the most difficult to understand. It is one that people read and kind of scratch their heads and think, what was Jesus actually trying to say by that story? And to be short, there's a lot of secondary issues within this story that are really hard to get. Well, what did Jesus mean by including this little detail? And throughout 2,000 years of church history, those little details have been discussed and debated. And I don't know if we're going to be able to answer every single question somebody might have about this particular story. However, the very center of the story, the main point that Jesus was trying to communicate through this story is pretty clear and largely agreed upon. And it is that central truth that Jesus is trying to drive home that we're going to hit on today. Now, before we begin really with the story, I just want to reiterate the announcement that Eric made. So this Friday night at 6:30 in here, there is an evening for prayer with some worship. We're going to focus on different ways of praying for our community and our nation and our world, as well as our church. And then the next Friday night, we're going to have a Good Friday service in here, also at 6:30. And that will be a communion service on Good Friday. So 2 Fridays in a row, 6:30 in here. I'm going to go ahead and just pray, and then we'll begin the story then. Father, once again, you ask that you would be with us, that your Spirit would be in this place, that through this story that, Lord, a lot of people sometimes find difficult to understand, that somehow you would speak to us. Lord, that you would print eternity on our eyes, and that our priorities would come into line with heaven's priorities. Lord, give us ears to hear. Amen. All right, so it begins in verse 1. He also said to his disciples. Now that word also is kind of important for context right here. So, you just want to mentally circle that word also. This isn't happening in a vacuum, this story. Something has been going on in chapter 15. You guys know that not everything in your Bible is inspired? Yeah, the chapter divisions, the little numbers. Human beings put them in like 1,000 years later. It made Bible studies a lot easier. But sometimes these chapter divisions come at the worst possible time. So when you begin a chapter and start in verse 1, you think you're like beginning a new story, and very often you're not. You're kind of halfway through the story that began the chapter before. And this is the case in this story. If you go back to chapter 15, something is happening, and it is a fellowship conflict of sorts. The table fellowship is being discussed. See, Jesus, he's becoming very popular, but he's becoming popular with who many people think are the wrong sorts of people. Jesus is supposed to be a rabbi. Rabbis are supposed to be upstanding members of, the community. They're supposed to be respectable. They're supposed to have a sort of moral and social dignity about them in the community. And Jesus was just breaking too many rules here. Jesus was at a party, and all the wrong sorts of people were at the party. Sinners were at the party. These were shocked, prostitutes and thieves, and far worse, like IRS agents were there. Like all the bad people were there that, should not be at the party. The tax collectors, they were all there. And the other rabbis, the Pharisees, the moral, upstanding, respectable members of the community were like, it's a shame just all going downhill, isn't it? Ever since that new rabbi rocked into town with his, miracles and all his stories and parables, things are just going downhill. Look at who he's partying with. Look at who he's having dinner with. And they were scolding him for this. And so, if you can kind of see, Jesus is at a big party, and there's kind of like different corners. Like Jesus and his disciples. So the people who are faithfully following him. And then in the other corner, there's like the people from the other side of the tracks, all the wrong people. And then there's kind of the Pharisees. So you have three different groups of people. The Jesus followers, the respectable, moral people, and then the immoral, irreligious, dissolute people. And this is the dynamic. And then there's Jesus. Now Jesus then, in chapter 15, tells a lot of his better-known parables. The parable of the lost sheep. How one shepherd, a shepherd lost one sheep and he left the 99 to go find the one. And a similar one with coins. There's this woman who lost a coin and she searched the house and found the coin. And then probably one of the most popular parables Jesus ever told was the parable of the lost son. Or the prodigal son, it's sometimes called. That the man had two sons, and one went off and engaged in wild living and blew all his father's inheritance and on all the wrong things. And he returned to his father, and his father welcomed him back. And then, so he's telling these parables, and then, chapter 16, he also said to his disciples. So in this context of Jesus trying to communicate the value of a lost human being, Jesus tells this next parable. And even though there was a mixture of people there, Pharisees, those that culture thought of as sinners, and his disciples, he kind of turns and he's speaking primarily to the disciples. These, in today's term, we would say these were the Christians or the church. And even though the sinners and the Pharisees, even though they're all hearing the parable as well, and as we see at the very end, they have some comments for Jesus. The Pharisees aren't really impressed by this last parable. He is speaking to his disciples. So this is the context. We are talking about the value of lost human souls. That is the context. Jesus is sort of explaining why it is that he goes to parties and makes friendships with all these people that normal, respectable rabbis would not do. So, he also said to his disciples, and he tells the story. I'm not going to go through it verse by verse. You just heard it being read to you. All right, this is coming loose again. Okay. You heard the parable, and it's kind of a weird one, isn't it? It starts off, there is this manager of a man's wealth. Now, this wouldn't be unusual in that day. If you had one very wealthy individual who owned lots of lands and lots of investments, you would have very often a personal manager of their finances. Someone who would take care of everything for them. Someone who could legally act on their behalf. Someone who could sign documents on behalf of the rich individual. This was sort of a, for those of you in the corporate world, this was the COO, the CFO, like all squeezed in together. He was the chief financial officer for all the estates having to do with this particularly wealthy individual. He had power of attorney. He could sign things. He was a very powerful, very important individual. And as his accusations were brought against this person, they found some emails. A laptop was discovered. Something happened. Some evidence came up that this guy was maybe crooked. And the owner, the rich man, he wasn't too happy. Obviously, he had given a lot of trust to this particular manager. It's a very close relationship that a lot of trust is needed. And evidence came forward that not everything he was doing was legit. There was a little bit of fraud going on. He was cutting out a little bit of wealth for his side and tucking it away. And so the owner says, listen, I have this evidence in front of me. I can't continue to let you be, my CFO. You can't continue to be the steward over this wealth. And so finish up what you're doing. I'm going to go find somebody else to replace you. But your time here is limited. You have till the end. He doesn't say exactly how much time, but you have till the end of the month. Finish up, clear up the accounts, finish the books. Your days here are numbered. And so, what does it say? It gives a little bit of the guy's self-talk. What is he thinking to himself? When he hears this, he thinks, oh, what in the world am I going to do? I can't dig ditches. I don't have any blue-collar skills. I just know how to keep the books and write the numbers and everything else. I don't know what I'll do. It might get out that I committed some act of fraud for this guy, and then maybe no one else will hire me to be a steward. And he's thinking, wow, I'm too young to retire. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? I don't want to beg and sit on the street corner, and that's just humiliating. And what in the world am I going to do when my job comes to an end because my days are numbered? And he has an idea. He goes, I know what to do. As it says in verse 4, I have decided what to do so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. Meaning they'll find some sort of employment for me within their estates, within their houses. Business for the wealthy, businesses were done out of their house. That's it. Some people will find a good job for me within their house, within their estate. And what does he do? Well, we saw. He goes up to all his master's debtors, and he sits down, and he's in the final days of his employment. And he sits down, and you're like, right, how much do you owe my master? You know what? Let's reduce that a lot. Let's cut that in half. Instead of owing my master 100 barrels of oil, we'll just reduce that to 50. And wheat, well, reduce that from 100 to 80 bushels of wheat. And he started giving these massive discounts. Now, some commentators say what he was doing was wiping out the interest. That they had been loaned 50 barrels of oil, and therefore they were just paying 50 back without any interest. And that these were standard rates of interest for both oil and wheat, and therefore he was still acting within the law to be able to reduce the interest without actually reducing the principal. And I've read different people have speculation on. That's one of those secondary issues about the parable that people don't all agree on. Like, how did you do this legally and not end up in jail? So there's a lot of thought been going into that for the last 2,000 years. I don't really know. I don't think it's very central to the parable. But whether he was just knocking off all the interest from his master's debtors or he was actually cutting into the principal of the loan, it's not clear. It's not really the point of Jesus' parable. So whatever your opinion on that, fine, think about it, read a commentary or two, make up your mind, but it's not central to the point. It's not the reason Jesus is telling the parable. So he goes around to his master's debtors and says, listen, I'm reducing your debt. I'm reducing your debt. And all of a sudden, this steward becomes wildly popular. He becomes wildly popular in that whole upper echelon of the top tier of society, there within the aristocracy of Israel. All the kind of the well-to-do, the hoity-toity, they all like him because they get discounts from this guy. They get discounts from this guy. And so, after he's reduced everybody's debt, it says, and this is kind of weird, the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. The master commended him for his shrewdness. Now, I don't know, I would have thought that he would have been pretty angry myself. And maybe he was, but yet something about the dynamic of the relationship, the master looked at him and says, oh, I see what you did there. Well played. Well done, that was pretty clever. You used your remaining days in office to eliminate all the interest from my debtors. Now I'm out some money, but I see how you played that to your own advantage. Well done, and there's the door. You're leaving. But you were very shrewd. Shrewdness. And then Jesus says, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. Shrewdness, is that supposed to be a Christian virtue? Yes, no, I can see the looks. You're like, this is a trick question, isn't it? I'm not going to raise my hand one way or the other. I don't know where this is going. Is shrewdness a Christian virtue? I remember once a pastor, I believe his name was Lloyd Ogilvie. He was a Presbyterian minister out in Hollywood, California. And I remember him telling the story of how he was on a plane, and just by chance, he was sitting next to a really successful businessman, and a pretty well-known one. He kind of recognized him. He's like, oh, I think I know who you are, and I've read about in the newspaper about some of your businesses. And he gets in a conversation with the guy, and this pastor is asking this businessman some questions. And he says, well, tell me a little bit about what it is that, has made you so successful. And the guy begins telling, he says, man, I live night and day for this, and I plan really well. And he kept using this word shrewd. He goes, you have to be shrewd in your business dealings. You have to be clever. You really have to be thoughtful. And, you can't just let things slide. And he used the word shrewd very often to talk about how he advanced in business and how he prospered and how his finances were growing, how all his businesses were doing so well. It's like, you can't be sloppy. You have to be shrewd and know your goal and go for it and give it 100%. At the end, this pastor just was listening to the guy, and he was so impressed by his stories and his passion and conviction and his way of talking. And he said, you know what? If us pastors were half as shrewd and intense about winning souls as you are about gaining money, our country would have revival. This word shrewd, it can create different things to different people's minds, but there's something about this idea of shrewdness that one has to be creative, one has to be intentional, one has to be thoughtful, one has to know the goal of what it is they're pursuing and sacrifice things for to get to that end. And what Jesus is saying is, a lot of times people in the world, they're far more shrewd going after worldly things, such as money, than my disciples are in pursuing things for the kingdom. Or as my disciples, the sons of light, can be very sloppy, very half-hearted. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their dealing with their own generation than with the sons of light. And Jesus says, listen, you can learn from this guy. Guys, you can learn from this shrewd manager. You can learn something from him. I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth. Now, the word here for wealth is a word called mammon. And it doesn't directly mean money, but it includes money. It kind of means like stuff. Like, I don't know, all your stuff. Your resources, your abilities, your time, your energy, your house, your car, your money, your stuff. Well, what it is that makes you a wealthy individual. More than just money, but definitely including that. Make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. I don't know if you've ever traveled abroad to like a different country before, and if you have, you've had to travel through an international airport. And when you do, you see these little currency exchange places everywhere. You know, if you're traveling from America, and maybe you're going to Mexico, or you're going over to Europe, or you see these places where you can take your dollars and you hand them your dollars, and then they give you back the currency of the place you're going to. Pesos, British pounds, euros. If you go to Japan, you get some yen. You know, you would trade your money for the wealth of the country it is that you're going to. And this is what Jesus is telling us to do. Use your wealth in this life to invest it in such a way that you have treasures in heaven. Exchange the unrighteous mammon for the things that are eternal. And what is it in this instance that he says is eternal? People. Use your unrighteous wealth. Invest it. Exchange it. Use it in such a way in this life so that when you get to heaven, there are a lot of people who say, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the way I was poor and you fed me while I was on earth. Thank you. You gave money to missionaries who came to my village and handed out Bibles, and I got baptized and became a Christian because you gave that money. And I'm here today because of your investment. Thank you. Your priorities and your set of values 5 minutes after you die will be very different than your set of priorities and values 5 minutes before you die. We will. We as much as we want to have eternity's values, we often fail in this regard. Jesus is saying, try to think about what's going to be important 5 minutes after you die. 5 minutes after you die, what is it that you think you're going to value? What is it 5 minutes after you stepped out of time and into eternity and you kind of look back at your life, 5 minutes later, what is going to be important to you? And Jesus says, learn to begin to value that now. Live in such a way that you use unrighteous mammon, this stuff that is just temporal, not that it's bad or evil, not that our houses or our cars or our resources or our time or our money or our businesses or anything like that. It's not that they're evil, but they're temporary. They're not righteous in the eternal sense. They have a shelf life. Our money, our wealth, our houses, all that stuff is either righteous or unrighteous simply based on how we use it. Is money bad or is money good? Well, I don't know. It depends what you're using it for. Are you using it for the glory of God and to help people? Are you using it for some good purpose that honors the whole reason that you were created for? Doesn't mean we don't spend money on ourselves. We all have needs. We need to be clothed. We need shelter. We need food. Fine, we get that. But what about with our disposable income? If you were to look at our bank statements, would it say something about our priorities? Well, what does it do? If someone just look at your bank statement, my bank statement, would someone look at that and think, that person has a different set of values than their neighbors? They don't. There's something different about this bank statement than there is. It's almost like they're really interested in what happens in eternity. It seems to be, is that what Jesus is saying? Don't shoot the messenger. What is Jesus saying? He says, use your manna. Use it now and exchange it. And when you get to heaven, it's going to be waiting for you. And it's going to be waiting primarily in the form of other people. That they will receive you into eternal dwellings. You know, in this life, relationships are hard. Love, it doesn't work very well in this life. A lot of what we call love in this life is us simply liking people that make us feel good. A lot of the times when we say, I love you, deep down what we mean is, I really love the way you make me feel. And in this life, I don't know how we can get away from that. Even with some of our best friends, even with our kids and spouses and family, still at some level, when I say I love you, yeah, sometimes it's kind of selfless, but other times it's kind of selfish too. It just, you know, I'm not that sanctified yet, I guess. I don't know. But when I say I love you, I can say I love my wife, I love my kids, I love tacos, man. You know? I love the way this person or this thing, I love how they enrich my life. I love the way they make me feel. And love in this world, because of the presence of sin, is always corrupted a little bit. Now, I'm not saying we can't have more pure love or less pure love. Of course, we can get better at loving. But until we step into eternity, even our best love is going to be tainted to some degree. And when we step in the next world, we're going to find ourselves in an ocean of perfected love. How many of you have been in relationships before? I don't mean just romantic relationships necessarily. It can be friendships or family relationships. But you've been in relationships where you realize that you love the other person far more than they love you. Yeah? You're into them and into the relationship, and you realize the other person is a lot more half-hearted. And you're like, oh, I've kind of invested a lot in this relationship. I'm really trying to make this work. It seems like I'm doing 80% of the work here, and you're not. That's hurtful, isn't it? Unrequited love. Again, I don't mean just in terms of romance, although that's certainly true, but it can be in friendships or family relationships. You're doing so much to reach out to your parents, or your children, or your siblings, and they're not reciprocating in the same way. That's hard. In heaven, there is no unrequited love. Every act of love, every expression of love will be perfectly and fully requited. It will be given back in equal, if not greater measure. In this life, we are like beached whales. We're not here for very long, and it's often not very fun while we are. We're here for a short time, and it's not a lot of fun because it's not our natural home. We were meant for a world of perfect love, and yet a lot of our life is just dealing with difficult relationship after difficult relationship. And in heaven, it's not that way. In heaven, you'll be able to love freely. We won't have to be so reserved. We won't have to wear a mask. We won't have to worry, should I give this person a hug, or would that be kind of awkward? Maybe they're not really a hug sort of person. You don't have to worry about any of that. Sometimes we feel love for a person, but because of culture and difficulties and awkwardness in relationship, it's like we're trying to squeeze, a whole bath of water through a little straw. It just doesn't work. Culture, relational dynamics, it doesn't allow for it. But one day in heaven, it won't be that way. Invest what you have now into the things that are going to matter later on. Use it in that way. Not for your own glory. This is why Jesus put such an emphasis on things being done in secret. He said, listen, when you give money to the poor, don't let it be in front of everyone, because then you'll already have your earthly reward. Because you did it to be seen by people. Instead, give in secret. Or when you're praying for others, don't make a big deal out of it. Hey everyone, I have a ministry and a gift of prayer, and right now I am praying for you. Aren't I super spiritual? Jesus says don't do that. When you pray for people, try to do it in secret. It doesn't mean we can't, when we gather, have public prayer. Sometimes when we all pray together as a group, obviously somebody needs to pray out loud, and there's leaders. But Jesus is saying, look, spend a lot, if you're going to pray in public, spend more time praying in private first. Spend more time praying in private where no one sees you than praying in public where people do see you. Why? Is it so you can keep your priorities straight? Are you doing it to advance yourself in the eyes of a faith community, to make yourself look more spiritual? Or are you doing it to please God? Are you doing it because you really love the people you're praying for? Jesus says, one who is faithful in very little is faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in very little is dishonest in very much. If you then have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful, that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. He says, guys, be faithful in the earthly stuff you've been given. Now, I'm going to say something that usually, when I've said it before in other churches, isn't very popular. People don't like this. My last church didn't like it when I said it either, and other places I've been. But and it's this: church is a business. No, everyone says church isn't a business. Church is a family. Church is a family. No, church is a family. And it's also a business. And it's also an army. You want to go through the New Testament and look at all the metaphors for church? We're a bride. We're an army. We're a family. We're business. This is what Jesus is saying here. I'm giving you resources. Steward them well. And we need all the metaphors of the New Testament. We need sometimes to see ourselves as an army, ready to sacrifice and endure hardships and destroy the works of the devil. We need to see that. We need to know that metaphor. We need the metaphor of a family, that we're brothers and sisters. We look out for one another. We care for one another. And we need the metaphor of a business. God's given us resources. God's given us some money. God's given us a building. How do we best use that for the business of the kingdom of God? We need that metaphor too. Very often, that metaphor is neglected because it seems unspiritual or somehow that it might conflict with the family metaphor. But it doesn't. Not in Jesus' thinking. We need to invest our resources both individually as Christians as well as a church corporately. How can we best invest our resources to get the gospel to our community? If you prefer another word other than business, let's use a more spiritual sounding word, stewardship. Okay, I like that one. But in the New Testament, in the Gospels, it's the same thing. When it talks about a dishonest steward or a dishonest man, it's talking about management. Management and business and delegation of resources. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things. So remember, Jesus is speaking, and he's speaking to his disciples, but there's also the Pharisees present as well as the sinners. And the Pharisees heard this. They were lovers of money and heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. And he said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God." These guys are offended at what Jesus is saying because Jesus has just... Remember, what was the parable he told right before this? It was the parable of the what? The prodigal son, the lost son, yeah. And what did the lost son do? Wasted as well, yes. He wasted what? Man, he went out and he blew it all on Texas Hold'em and OnlyFans subscriptions, and he just blew it all. Like on gambling and sexual immorality and drugs. I mean, he blew all his money. He wasted his money. And then Jesus tells this parable. And what's the implication of this parable? He says, there's another way to waste your wealth. A way that seems far more respectable. If you don't invest your money in eternal friendships, if you don't invest your money in people, if you don't invest your money in the kingdom of God, if you don't give your money and use it in such a way, in eternity's values, to glorify God and to serve and help others, then you may be respectable. There might not be a hint of drug abuse or sexual immorality or gambling or any of these other disrespectable things, but Jesus is saying your money is just as wasted. Because it's been lost. You haven't been able to take any of it with you. What is it we can take out of time? What are the things we can take out of time and into eternity? 5 minutes after we die, what are we going to have with us that we had while we were in this life? What are those things we can actually take with us? I mean, there's a lot of stuff we can't, but what does the Bible say we can take with us? Well, you could frame it a few different ways. One, good deeds. Good deeds done not for our own glory. Look what a great Christian I am. None of that stuff, but genuine good deeds done out of love and faith for other people. They go with us. Our character goes with us. Let him who is righteous to be righteous still. Our character goes with us, who we are as people. Have we worked on our character? Have we become more faithful, more patient, more loving, more at peace? Are we taking that with us? Our character? What else can we take? Relationships. People that we serve, people that we loved. We did it for the King of Kings. Those relationships are going to go with us into eternity as well. Are we using the stuff God has given us? And are we using it with eternity's values in mind? This is the challenge Jesus gives us. There's an unrespectable way to waste your money, but there's also a respectable way to waste your money. And not just money, but all our wealth, our time, our talents, our resources. Maybe you're really good at something and God's given you a special ability that other people don't have. Great. Are you only using it for your own advancement? Again, I'm not trying to say you don't use it to go out and get a job and make money and support your family. Of course we do that. We have earthly responsibilities as well. But are we also asking ourselves, how can I use this talent not just to provide for me and my family, which is good and important, but how can I also use this to glorify God? How can I also use this for eternity's values? I was with some men from the church earlier this week, and we were discussing Johnny Cash music. And there's one album called My Mother's Hymn Book, and he kind of sings all these old hymns, and it's real. If you're not familiar with the album, it's just him on the guitar. Like, it's nothing fancy. It's just his voice and him there, I think, on an acoustic guitar. And he sings all these old hymns. And one of the things that's striking about all these hymns is how often he's talking about eternity. How often he's talking about heaven. And one song in particular that we were discussing was "I'm Going to the Promised Land." It's an old hymn. I don't know. I actually didn't check. I don't know if it's in our hymn book or not. But I'm going to the promised land, and Johnny Cash kind of sings it in his typical rich, deep voice. And it just starts off on Jordan's stormy banks I stand, and cast a wishful eye to Canaan's fair and happy land, where my possessions lie. Can we sing that with any integrity and honesty? That I look across to the promised land, and that's where my possessions lie. That's where my true treasures lie. Can we sing that same hymn in the same way that Johnny Cash sung it? We're coming to the table of the Lord here for the bread and the wine. And though I know this has been kind of a challenging message, I mean, it's a challenging parable. And I have to do it too. And, it's kind of sometimes sneaky as a pastor or anyone who works for the church, because in some ways, a lot of what we do, it's just our job. Like getting up here and preaching on a Sunday morning, like this is just my job, in a sense. Now, hopefully, I prayed a lot into it, and hopefully it's more than just a job, but it's also just a job. And very often as a pastor, I have to think, well, what am I doing for Christ that's not part of my job? How am I giving? How am I serving? Who am I praying for? Maybe that's outside of the congregation that I'm responsible to care for. What is God calling me as I mean, this week I've had to think about this a lot. You know, if it's your job to do it, you're really not getting any credit for it any more than it's anybody else's job. I mean, you can do your job well, or you can do your job poorly, or I know we can all do our jobs in a way that honor God and with the right attitude, or not, but I'm thinking, okay, how is this challenging to me? Because, you know, everybody has their job, things they're supposed to do. But what am I doing that no one sees? What am I doing that won't come up in my annual review? What am I doing for the kingdom that none of the elders are going to ask me about when they sit down and review my work performance through the year? What secret things am I doing for the kingdom of God that just won't be covered? No one will know about. And I've had to ask myself that question. So as I'm preaching this and, you know, I'm kind of relaying the challenge of the parable to you guys, all week I've been thinking through it myself. Like, right, what can I do? And here's your homework assignment. On your way home, for those of you who are married, you can ask your spouse. For those of you who are not married, a sibling or a family member or a friend, talk to them. Ask yourselves, how can we better use our resources for the values of eternity? That's your discussion. It can be on the car on the way home. It can be over pot roast, wherever. How can we better use our resources for eternity? What will I want my resources to have been invested in 5 minutes after I die? That's different to maybe how I'm investing them now. But I know this comes as a challenge, comes as a challenge to me, comes as a challenge to all of us. But I don't want to leave you just with the challenge because we're coming to the Lord's table. I want to give you good news. I really want us to come to the table not with the challenge hanging over our heads thinking, oh boy, phew, okay, that one made me sweat this morning. Yeah, okay, I do want you to sweat just a little bit, but that's not the main thing when we come to the table. Because throughout this parable, we've been presuming that we need to be better managers. That the stuff that we have, the houses we own, the money we have in the bank, ultimately that's from God. Now, of course, there may be one or two people said, yeah, I earned my money, thank you very much. Well, great, who gave you your energy? Who gave you your mind? Who gave you your abilities? Do you really think that if you were born in like 13th century Mongolia, that you would have earned just as much money as you have? No, of course not. Who gave you the opportunities to get that education? Who gave you the opportunity to develop those skills? Who gave you the energy and the brains to do it? That all came from God. We are managers over His resources. And we can learn a lot from this challenge. But we're also convicted because we know that in some ways all of us are like the dishonest manager, that we've all committed fraud at some level. We're all guilty of fraud. God's given us a lot of stuff. And He's been like, right, here's your stuff. Use it to take care of yourself and your family and your loved ones, but also invest some of it back in the kingdom. And a lot of times we've just totally neglected that last part. Totally and completely. And God's been like, you know, you're treating my money a lot like if it was your own money. That's an interesting way of going about doing it. But we have good news. We have good news in that this parable just isn't about us. This parable is about Jesus, by way of contrast. Jesus was the perfect manager of all of heaven's resources. And when He comes to us, He comes to turn His enemies into friends, eternal friends. And He does that not just by reducing a debt, He does that by totally eliminating our debt. By totally eliminating the debt that we owed God, He came and He eliminated the debt of sin that we owed heaven. He eliminated that at the cost of His own blood. If this was a parable about a dishonest manager, Jesus is the true and perfect manager of all of heaven's riches. And He comes to us, just like the manager did, to make friends. Not so that we would greet Him, but so that one day He could greet us and say, well done, good and faithful servant. As we come to the juice and the bread, I want to invite the elders to come on up now. This was a parable about debts being reduced, but as we share this juice and this bread, this is about debts being completely forgiven. and wiped away. One day we're going to be entering a world of perfect love, of perfect friendship, of perfect relationships. And we're doing that because his body was broken for us. Our relationships will one day be healed because his body was one day broken apart. I'm going to pray, and then the elders are going to pass around the bread and the juice. Please hold on to them. And then when we're all done, we'll eat the bread and we'll drink the juice together at the same time. Father, as we come to your table, help us to remember the good way in which Jesus faithfuled all of his resources, even to the point of death, so that we could be reconciled and welcomed back into heaven. Lord, I pray that good news would give us something to celebrate. Not only would we feel challenged by this parable, but, Lord, that we would also feel encouraged by the work that you have done, for the example you have given that has resulted in our salvation. Amen. It is with thankfulness that we come to this part of our service, knowing that God demonstrates His love for us in this, and that while we were still God's enemies, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us so that He could make us into His friends and welcome us into eternal dwellings. Let's take the bread and eat. And we take the juice. Represents the blood of Christ. How He shed His blood for us to justify us and to give our life and existence meaning in the light of eternity. That after everything else has faded away, and all of our houses have been eaten by termites, and all of our gold and silver has been rotted away, and we've lost everything else and every other treasure, our existence has meaning because we are loved by God and forgiven by God and redeemed by God. And we have treasure that beats death itself and passes into eternity. We are a part of His body and have entered into His covenant, a part of His family. Let us drink in thankfulness. Church, we're now at the end of our service. My prayer for today is that we know with as much clarity as that unjust, corrupt manager did, that his days were numbered, that he was coming to an end. That one day we know with just as much clarity and just as much certainty that our days in this life are numbered, and we're going to be passing into eternity. Yes, that can be sobering and challenging at times, but other times that's a word of great joy. That one of these days we're going to step out of this life and we're going to step into eternity where we hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." That we're going to be welcomed by our Father because of Jesus as His friends forever and ever. That day is coming. That day will be wonderful. That day will be sobering. Let us live for that day, with the hope of that day and the values of that day ever before us. May God bless you and keep you throughout the week and keep you in His joy and in His perfect love. Amen. As Eric said at the beginning, he was praying for the world and the community and the state of Nebraska. If you've come with a personal prayer request and you have a personal need and you would like to be prayed for, please come forward at the end. Both myself and maybe some others will be up here, and we'd love to listen to you and pray. God bless.